All right. Okay. So our final talk today, I'm going to talk to you about the situation that's occurring and actually evolving in Ukraine. And I'll say I'm a little humbled by this because as each minute goes by, something new is happening there. So this talk might be outdated even before I'm done. But I wanted to get a sense of what's happening with the protests. As many of you may know, Tuesday was a particularly violent day in the protest, and then that's continued through today as well. And the most recent rumors, just as one of the students came in, said that over 100 people have been killed in the last day or so. So it's an ongoing situation. This all began in November when the president of Ukraine, Yanukovych, this gentleman down here, pulled out of an agreement with the European Union. It was an association agreement, an agreement that would have pulled or linked Ukraine more closely economically and politically with the European Union. So Yanukovych pulls out of this and instead turns east. Turns towards Russia and a similar economic deal that Vladimir Putin was offering. There's going to be a lot of connections between Russia and Dr. Chad talk and my talk. But if you've had a chance to see any of the images, they're stunning. Stunning in terms of their beauty, but also the sort of the power. This is a picture that was taken on Tuesday during the protest. And it really looks like something out of the French Revolution, right? It should be a painting or a picture, something that has historic ties. This is another, I think, just incredibly powerful picture. The riot police, the Ukrainian riot police on one side, the protesters are on the other side, and a couple Orthodox priests separating the two. Imagery, just very, 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 very powerful. Here we go. The lone piano player playing a piano painted in EU colors, right? So the symbolism is thick here. Playing John Lennon's Imagine. Again, the divide between East and West here. This is a picture from Independence Square. And for the most part, the protests have been peaceful. There have been a couple pockets of violence, and the last couple days have been particularly violent, but it has been, for the most part, a quiet and peaceful protest. But the violence has been troubling, and you see lots and lots of Molotov cocktails. Protesters are grabbing bricks, Molotov cocktails, whatever they can grab. Also tires, right? Anytime you've got a protest, you got to find a lot of tires. More tires, right? And so the protesters have around Independence Square created a zone of fire where basically these tires are burning. This one's my favorite. This captures a bit of the practical side of having a protest. So I imagine about 30 seconds before this picture was taken, this guy was looking around. Do we need one more tire? One more? Another? Okay, one more. All right, then we're done, right? And then he drops the tire. So the visuals are, again, very, very powerful. You might be asking, why Ukraine? Of all the international topics we can be looking at, what's significant about Ukraine? Why not talk about Syria? Why not talk about the Central African Republic or what's going on in Venezuela? I think the reason Ukraine is so interesting is that there are so many storylines. It really feels like a movie. I'm going to talk about a couple of them. Beginning with a bad relationship that's just getting worse, right? So the United States and Russia, again, I've stolen Dr. Chad's picture. I put a suitcase with Ukraine on it. But you get the sense here, when the Obama administration came into power, they had this big symbolic event where they brought Russia, the foreign minister from Russia, and Hillary Clinton, and they came together and they pushed a reset button. They said, things have been bad, but we're going to reset. Now, the reset button actually looked just like the button you would push to launch a nuclear attack. That was not a great idea, but we were going to try to be friends again. And what's happened is that relationship has soured, and Ukraine has essentially turned into a proxy war, where the United States is pushing for the western part of Ukraine and to pull Ukraine towards the European Union, and Vladimir Putin in Russia is trying to pull Ukraine back. Second, so there are three major opposition groups I'm going to talk about today. One of them is a nationalist group, very, very nationalist, and you can tell their flag is three fingers, very, very similar to a four-finger salute. And the Ukrainian administration has been suggesting that these are ultra-nationalist actually fascist, drawing connections back to Hitler. It's been a very, very effective tool to say, who's in this opposition? You know, these are rabid right-wing nationalists, and we shouldn't support the protesters. I know certainly some of that is propaganda pushed by the Ukrainian government and by Russia, but there is some truth to that nationalist element. And it reminds us that we should think about, just because a group is protesting an autocratic leader, that doesn't mean they believe in democracy. History is full of protest groups who want to get rid of one dictator and replace him with another. So it's something to think about as we dissect and look more deeply at the opposition group. All right, the next president of Ukraine, so once Yanukovych is eventually gone, might be a former boxing heavyweight champion. Klitschko, so this is the guy on top where he's punching Lennox Lewis. He was a former heavyweight champion. He still holds some titles. Here he's hanging out with Stallone. Don't hold him against him, right? So you have this dynamic, right, where you've got a major international boxer who's in one of the opposition parties. When the next presidential election come around, many think that he might be a leader. All right, phone tapping and cursing out the EU. And this time, it's not the United States who's tapping phones. So you might have heard the last couple weeks there was a phone conversation between the Assistant Secretary of State and the U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine that was tapped. They were talking about what to do in Ukraine, and toward the end of that conversation, Victoria Nuland, the Assistant Secretary of State, was talking about being excited about a bigger role for the United Nations, and she says that would be great to help glue this thing and to have the UN help glue it. And you know, F the EU! It's not very diplomatic. No, it was a private phone conversation. Rumors have it that Russia was the one bugging, and then Russia was the one who tweeted this out. All right, you can't talk about Ukraine without Ukraine talking about poisoning. We'll get to that a little bit later. A long history of poisoning politicians. All right, topless feminist protesters, right? If you weren't interested in boxers and Cold War and all that kind of stuff, topless feminist protesters should get your attention. There's a group, a women's rights group in Ukraine called Femin. They're very active throughout throughout Europe. They're headquartered in Ukraine, pushing for women's rights. And since the protests have begun, they played a very powerful role pushing back against the president of Ukraine, Yanukovych, showing up at all sorts of protests, getting arrested. The top picture is an event that they ran, and so you see here, this is Vladimir Putin and Prime Minister of Germany, Angela Merkel. And if you want to understand the difference between Putin and Merkel, look at their reactions to a topless woman running at them, right? Merkel can't get out of the way quick enough, and Putin's eyes are bugging out of his head, right? So this is another storyline that's playing out. And again, all of this is playing out with the backdrop of the Olympics. So as we think about timelines and what's really happening here, Putin is boxed in a corner for now. He's got to play nice. He's got to be pleasant, because everybody's watching. But the Olympics will soon be over, and then Russia's role in Ukraine might fundamentally change. All right, so that's why we're at Ukraine. Let's look at a map and talk about why Ukraine's position matters a lot. So as we look at a map of Europe, you see that you've got Russia on one side and you've got Europe on the other side. You can really think about this as a tug of war. And Ukraine is in the middle. And if we step back and look at a more historical map, look at a Cold War map. This is a map of the Soviet Union. The Ukraine just goes away. Right? So when the Soviet Union was around, they were part of the Soviets. So as we think about the interest and the passion that Russia has, and the role and the way they see the Ukraine, certainly part of the former Soviet Union. So that's why this is so important. And cartoons who've looked at the situation, they're all talking about pulling something, right? So here's an example of the EU and Russia fighting over a Ukraine map. Here's another one where it's buses, right? But it's the same theme. Always Ukraine in the middle. That's the President Yanukovych being pulled. This might be the best of the bunch. Like literally, Yanukovych, the president, being pulled apart. Russia pulling one direction, the EU pulling in another direction. So there he is. There's a close-up of Yanukovych. Up until this point, Ukraine's leaders have managed to balance this pressure to both placate the pull from Russia and from the EU. Now, Yanukovych certainly looked more to the east, and he has a good relationship with Vladimir Putin. Here they're winking at each other. That's nice. But you might be saying, this guy sounds familiar. I think I know this guy. Gotta go back to the Orange Revolution in 2004 in Ukraine. So in 2004, Viktor Yanukovych, current president, was running against Viktor Yushchenko. Normal election, things were proceeding, and suddenly Yushchenko doesn't look so good, right? Very handsome, not so handsome. And so, in a campaign, this sort of, people wonder about this. Turns out he's been poisoned. Dioxide poison, levels that should have killed him. It was a miracle he survived. We don't know who poisoned him, but I think you might have a guess who might have had a hand in all of this. So the election plays out, Yanukovych wins. Major voter fraud, voter intimidation. The public shows up, Independence Square's massive protest. The Orange Revolution. The orange was the color of Yanukovych's political party. Massive protest. The judiciary steps in and says, we need another election. They have another election that actually plays out fairly. Yushchenko wins. So he has a 5-year term. There's another presidential election. Yanukovych is back, this time running against Tymoshenko. This time, Yanukovych wins in 2010. Now he's learned, right? He's learned how to handle an election. After about a year or so goes by, he arrests Tymoshenko. She brings her up on charges of political corruption, sticks her in a jail, right? So the opposition leader, the big leader for the public, is in jail, still in jail today. So which leaves us with who is the nature, who is this opposition? The big three. So these are the big three leaders in opposition. One is Klitschko, the guy we talked about, former world boxing champion. His party is named Ukraine Democratic Alliance for Reform, UDAR, which literally means punch, right? There's no subtlety here. He's been on the ground, he's been active in leading some of the protests. All right, our second guy, Ole Tannenbach. He is the leader of that ultra-nationalist party I talked about. He's been hanging out with John McCain and trying to appeal to the West, but certainly there are more nationalists. His party believes in building on the Ukrainian language and the Ukrainian identity and culture, right? So very, very nationalist. He got himself into trouble. He likes to talk about the Russian Jewish mafia that runs Ukraine. Not particularly sensitive, right? So here's our nationalist. Our third candidate is Arseniy Yatsenyuk. This is your bureaucrat. This is the guy who's been foreign minister, he's been finance minister and speaker of the parliament. He's the most experienced, also the most boring. So you've got three, right? You've got your boxer, you've got your bureaucrat, and you have your nationalist. The way the media describes it, they say 3 leaders, no heroes. So Ukraine is looking for somebody who can take the lead. This is where the phone conversation gets in between Assistant Secretary of State Nuland and Pyatt. The U.S. we're talking about, we sure would like the bureaucrat to win. We're not so sure about the boxer. He's trouble. The nationalist is trouble. We'd like the bureaucrat to win. Not sure how that's all going to play out. All right, so stepping back, big picture. What does this all mean? Ukraine is a divided country. We can just look at some simple maps. This is a linguistic difference or division with Ukraine. The red are Russian speakers. The non-red area are the Ukrainian speakers. If you compare that to the electoral map, it's almost exactly the same, right? So we see here that language and culture is powerful. So as we move forward and start to think more about what do these protests mean, there's no consensus. So there are these protesters, right? And they do speak for a segment of the population. Those in Western Ukraine who would like to move more towards the European Union. But they only represent 40–45% of the population. East and Central Ukraine is very happy turning towards Russia. So there's no consensus on EU membership. There's no consensus on replacing Yanukovych, the current president. There's no consensus on keeping him, right? A divided country. What does that mean? Well, as we move forward, the country could split. It is possible that you see a divided Ukraine, 2 separate countries. It's also possible you see a civil war. Or it's also possible we just have prolonged violence like we've seen. Very, very problematic. And what happens is as the violence gets worse, as there's more and more violence, it emboldens the hard lines for each camp. So the nationalists become more hardline, Yanukovych's party become more hardline, and it's harder to find a political solution. Up until this point, they've been able to talk about politics, about areas that they could agree. Yanukovych has been open to bringing some of the opposition into the party. He's been open about possibly amending the Constitution. There's been some movement there. The opposition has done the same. They sat down at the same table. But as more and more people get killed, it's harder to moderate and temper those more extreme voices. So this is a big, big concern. What about the United States? How much leverage does the United States have? We certainly have interest in Ukraine, but we don't have a ton of leverage. Russia has a lot of power and a lot of leverage. Economic ties, oil ties, a lot of ways in which that Russia can influence the process. So I think the United States wants to stay engaged, should continue to stay engaged, and push for a peaceful political solution. But at the end of the day, as the Olympics pass, Russia's role and Vladimir Putin's role is going to rise. So I think we have to be hopeful that politics wins the day, but I don't think there's a certainty there. So we should continue to watch and keep track of what's playing out in Ukraine. All right, on that note, I'd like to thank everybody for coming. It was great to see so many people here, and thanks again.